Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode. This is great. I'm excited and tickled to bits as usual. I know I always am, but I'm very excited to have a couple of guests from West Point. So, you know, a chap with my accent and now sporting a British officer's mustache. You know, don't be fooled. This is from November, and I was a grunt. I like to say I worked for a living, but that might insult the two gentlemen that are on this call with me again today. So Sean and Rob, what you probably don't know is I was with the Royal Marine Reserves for a little while, City of London detachment. That's how I put myself through university. It was great fun, and what was really great fun is just crawling through mud. I just thoroughly enjoyed that as a kid. Prior to that, I was in the Air Training Corps and as a police cadet. So my life would have taken that sort of road, except I took a trip to Canada in 1993 and met a girl. So I stopped there for about 25 years, ended up getting into cybersecurity, which is policing of a kind, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. But ladies and gentlemen, the two guests I have are professors from West Point. And so let me just show you who they are by my fancy screen here. Sean Watts, the first gentleman, is Professor Watts, who teaches over at the United States Military Academy. And then we also have a colleague of his who goes by the name of Rob, but Professor Barnsby, who also teaches over there. And you can find both of these gentlemen either through West Point or through LinkedIn. But let me say a quick hello right now. In fact, why don't we start with you, Sean? Just give us, you know, your 60 seconds of career path, if you wouldn't mind. How did you get from going to who you were as, let's say, a college grad to being a professor at West Point, one of the most esteemed military academies in human history?
Well, sure, Eddie, and thanks for having us on. And just a bit of business before we get into the personal. I have, since rejoining U.S. government service, I've had to accustom myself to issuing a disclaimer. Yes. Of course, everything I say in today's podcast will have to be my personal views and cannot necessarily reflect the views of the United States government, the Department of Defense, or West Point. Okay, good. That's out of the way. So the personal side, yeah, my young professional life really started in the military. Before I went to law school, I was an armor officer. So that's in the United States Tank Corps, I guess you could call it. So I guess rather than crawling through the mud as you were, I was driving over the mud in a tank. After 4 years of that, the Army has a program that sends line officers to law schools. So I was picked up for that program, became a lawyer, and then served an additional 10 years of active duty as a military lawyer, as a JAG. Part of that career path involved a legal master's degree at the Army's JAG school in Charlottesville, Virginia. And that was my first exposure to the cyber realm. So this is roughly 2004 or so. And the school was offering a course on cyberspace and international law, and specifically the laws of war. I knew nothing about it at the time, but really enjoyed the course. And that launched me on a more, I'd say for the beginning first few years, an academic angle on it. So in my spare time, I would write on cyberspace and the laws of war and how they might interact or not interact. And then was invited eventually to a project, a big legal writing project sponsored by NATO. Spent a good 6 years on 2 volumes of work that explored how cyberspace and laws of war interact. Meanwhile, I stayed in the reserves. I was fortunate to be assigned to the United States Strategic Command. At the time, Strategic Command was the parent organization of the brand new US Cyber Command. So I had some small operational exposure, I guess I would say, to cyberspace and the laws of war there. Meanwhile, I was teaching in American University, mostly constitutional law, but also some international criminal law subjects and some law of war subjects. And then my most recent move was in August. In August, I joined the Department of Law at the United States Military Academy, and that's where I am today. I am co-director of our Lieber Institute on the Law of Land Warfare, and also co-editor-in-chief of a brand new blog that I can't resist the temptation to publicize here, and that is Articles of War. I'll probably send you, Eddie, if you don't mind, a link to Articles of War so that some of our listeners might check that out if they find it interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. Send it to me through the chat as Rob starts talking a few moments, and I'll have it up so that our listeners can take a look at it. Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction. And then Professor Barnsby, yeah. So, give us, you graduated from university, I'm assuming, and then something happened, and here you are today. Give us that in 60 or 120 seconds.
Thank you, Eddie, for having me, and I give the same disclaimer that Sean did. I met a girl too in college at West Point. Actually, I'm back home with her after our careers I'm teaching and she's working with executive leadership, Thayer leadership. But we met at airborne school as cadets at West Point. It's very romantic to meet at airborne school, and sparked on an Army career. And that spanned 20 years. I did military intelligence for a few years and then switched to JAG on the same program that Sean did. So we actually ended up going to the same law school, I think, William & Mary Law School. I'm pretty sure, I'm not sure if Sean mentioned that, but after that, you do various jobs in the military, as you know, prosecutor, deployments, and legal advisor in various places. But I happened to keep coming back to cyber law. And so what happens, I was fortunate after 20 years in service, able to retire and come here and teach, be the cyber law fellow at what we call the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. So I'm able to help them with research. And that is in fact where I work, and also teach the cadets, our future generation, cyber law with Sean. Sean and I have been teaching some of the first cadets through the cyber law course into becoming cyber officers in the military. So even though we're both civilians, we're able to teach and hopefully have a little bit of an impact with them there. So that's the short version. And I've been here for 4 years. So it's basically 24 years ago, graduated from West Point, and within 20 years of military, got to go to law school. 4 years, retired, working here.
Wonderful. Well, listen, gentlemen, I always say this, but it's sort of overstated, and therefore it's losing its, language is so powerful, it's losing its value. But I always thank people for serving in the military, so thank you. But, you know, we do that, it almost seems like a tradition now, which sort of sucks the value out of it a little bit. But I want to just mention that and say thank you, because, you know, I've got an affinity. There is a George Orwell quote that basically says, actually, I've got it a little bit so I don't have to butcher it. I've got it a little bit right in front of me here, because I'm writing a paper right now on geopolitical cyber events. And so it's, yeah, this is very pertinent. And Orwell once said, people sleep peacefully in their beds at night only because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. You know, and we're in an academic arena now. It's a violence of academia, because countries that formerly couldn't touch a very well-developed Western nation, and especially the United States, can today touch us. Now I'm thinking of, you know, North Korea, let's say. So if you think in traditional military terms, you know, what could North Korea possibly do to the United States and pretty much almost any of our allies? Almost nothing. And yet, when WannaCry, the adaptation of, I think that was Eternal Blue, wasn't it? WannaCry, I can't quite remember now, got pushed out to over 200,000 computers. Okay, I'm going to fact check myself in just a moment. And raked in hundreds of millions of dollars for the North Korean regime. So kind of interesting that now, all of a sudden, through keystroke, the battleground is weaponized thought. We see this in elections, Brexit, with my friends in the UK, right? Even with election meddling and interference in 2016 here. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Let's start out. In fact, Articles of War. I will share my screen real quick so people can see that. Right. So Articles of War. Sean, walk us through this. What is this? You wrote this. This is a blog that you're just starting.
Yeah, so it is a digital publication that we've started. You could call it a blog. We have a debate internally about what exactly it is, but I think that captures the sentiment that it's a blog. So I liked your term a moment ago, a contested space, that cyberspace is increasingly a domain where states are playing out contests over various national interests. We're seeing something of the same thing in the law. That is, the law is a contested space. To the extent that people envision law having some role in how states carry themselves out in cyberspace, well, what version of the law are we talking about here? Are we talking about a version of the law that is merely restricted to existing treaties? Or are we willing to expand our notion of law to include statements by corporations or by academics or by judges or by tribunals? How much of that law, those sources of law, do we bring into the equation? Articles of War is our attempt to work in the contested space of legal academia. There are more and more contributors in this space, more and more ideas about what the law says, what the law doesn't say, what it ought to say. And so a few years back, a good colleague of mine, Colonel Shane Reeves, He envisioned a center that would make contributions to that contested space, if you will, but do so from a military operational perspective. Our sense was that academia was especially well represented. I was a participant from academia in what the law would look like in cyberspace for a number of years. Judges and tribunals were increasingly represented and weighing in on what the law ought to look like. But there was a sense that the military had held back and that states had somewhat held back in the conversation. The conversation was a little out of skew. So our idea with Articles of War, not only in the cyber domain, but in all domains of military operations, was to bring and emphasize an operational perspective, to say that how the law looks, sure, it ought to be a function of traditional legal concerns, but also it's got to be something that's practicable. And who better to weigh in on what is practicable than the militaries who are carrying out these operations themselves?
So this is really interesting subject matter, because I was talking with a CISO of a healthcare organization. This was, I think, last year. It's just COVID makes every day like Groundhog Day, so I'm sort of losing track of time here. But he had a young fella in his organization. So, okay, big picture. They were wondering why one of their competitors in the healthcare, this is a hospital and a full-blown healthcare organization, one of their competitors, another hospital, I suppose, another healthcare organization, were taking their customers, their patients, and they couldn't understand how they were losing business. They found out that it had actually been hacked. So, okay, interesting, right? You know, I caught wind of all this way after the fact, and obviously law enforcement would have been involved. But here's what I wanted to focus on. One of this CISO's young fellas was so cheesed off about this without the CISO knowing, so this wasn't warranted by the organization. You probably know where I'm going with this already. Put a honeypot out on the dark web with fake customer data so that competitor, when they hacked it, it would detonate. Now, that's illegal, I believe, right, to do that. I don't think you can do that. And so it speaks to all sorts of interesting psychological developments. I think people are feeling like they are getting bombarded without protection. So they go out and they do these overt acts. So if you think about it in the physical crime world, if somebody came and broke into your house, you wouldn't probably then go and attack their house, right? But that's how I think we have to start thinking about this from the perspective of that gentleman I was talking to, who had to deal with not only being hacked, but the mess of his team member doing this illegal act. Rob, let me just get you chatting into the dialogue. What do you think about that? And what can organizations do? And these people aren't, they have general counsels, I suppose. It's an enterprise organization, but a CISO is now getting tangled into the law. What are your thoughts around that?
Right, and it's a great point, Eddie. And I think it was George Carlin had the great joke, if you're motivated enough to go to Tony Robbins' seminar, you probably don't need the Tony Robbins seminar. Well, if you're in this space, if you're motivated enough to think about such things and your corporate clients and friends are thinking about security, that's a good thing. Right. We certainly agree with that. If you're not thinking about it, you're in trouble, because these things do happen in the way that you've said, and many more things happen. We want to focus on defense. From a corporate, now it does intersect with what Sean's saying from international law. You are focused on states, meaning nations, able to conduct attacks following the law of war. And we have an interesting thing called defending forward, where we're saying everything is defense, anywhere. And that can be okay. But once we turn to offense, we have to abide by the principles of international law. We must distinguish between military and civilian, right? So there's this challenge. We must and use our proportionality principle. And we must only attack that which is necessary to secure the ends of the defeat. And that's not what corporations are dealing with. They're saying, hey, I want to protect my network. And so we can couch a lot of things as defense. In fact, the government has done this too in a lot of strategy doctrines. Let's frame things as a good defense, and reasonable minds can disagree as to whether that's actually offense masquerading as defense. Corporations don't have it as easy in a sense, because they're not allowed to, on behalf of the nation, engage in attacks that may cross borders. We have sovereignty issues, classic Westphalian concepts of international law that Sean's talking about. So we have a challenge here. We can have frustration, we have corporations, but the best thing is a good defense. And so then what does that look like? And I think you're involved in a lot of that, and your colleagues are doing a great job. At least if you think about that type of thing can be occurring. But we wouldn't necessarily want, my direct answer is we wouldn't want to necessarily engage in an attack because that would be unlawful under international law. You're violating sovereignty in many cases if you respond, particularly cross-border. And I think Sean could speak a little bit more to that, but that's the general challenge we have here, but at least we're thinking about and talking about it. And some would say there's public-private partnerships that can help us mitigate that challenge. Certainly the Solarium report that just came out, I'm not sure if your listeners have
Solarium report.
taken a look at that, but they talk a lot about, this was a bipartisan effort to a commission, Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Report came out in March basically saying we are going to work as partners with the private sector because you've heard the statistic, 85% of the network is controlled by private actors. So we're going to talk about our law of war issues as Sean is, which are extremely important to us as a matter of respecting international law and national sovereignty, but recognizing the challenges you're talking about. How do we get there? This is exactly right. I think you've called up this report. I commend to all, this is not the gift. This is not the gift to your listeners. Okay. This is a early freebie.
There you go.
I commend this report. This is not, an endorsement necessarily, but it's a public-private effort, bipartisan effort also, with lots of different communities involved, lawyers, technical, social community involved to produce this report of the way ahead. So I just commend that to your listeners if they have an opportunity to at least look at the executive summary.
So is that, will this report help people with the problem I just described for that CISO? It's like understanding, because I think the sentiment is we don't have air cover. I don't think that's true. And in fact, what we should probably do is we should talk about, look guys, you do have air cover, we just don't talk about it enough, right? So if you're aware of any air cover that corporations are getting from the government, let's discuss that. But I do think that people feel like they don't have it, which is why these young fellows go take these actions. Probably also young and energetic, right? So a little hot, and so he went and did this thing. But okay, well, let's talk about that. Is the government giving corporations air cover?
Well, my shorter answer to that is that it's the case that more information shared with companies. There's actually this laws on this that we encourage you to share information with the government so that we can help you with threats that are coming. So there's this idea that you should share as a corporation with the government what you're facing and that we will then help you. And certainly the right answer is if you have a major problem, FBI gets involved or DHS is the lead agency for a lot of these issues. So we wouldn't want to look past that as far as if they're major issues. We wouldn't want to have to deal with that in a vacuum as a corporation and just suffer in silence. We would want to talk to law enforcement. We wouldn't necessarily be talking to the Army about any sort of defense in nation. We're talking about fighting and winning the nation's wars, as I think Sean's suggesting, and we're adding the legal component as lawyers to do so legally. But I wouldn't skip past the law enforcement aspect, but understanding there's incentives, there's a disincentive actually to report some of these things. So we do have a challenge. I think it's more soft regulation. A lot of smart folks, the Israelis are a great example of this, you mentioned. And again, it's a great discussion, but you can basically have soft regulation, which says, we encourage you to do these kind of things, that we show you why it works, that if you work with the government, we can help protect. We're trying to protect the network from thousands of attacks every single day. So I think also a quick mention of, Cyber Command, Army Cyber Institute, as far as the thinking here that we're doing, is important because they're defending the nation, but they wouldn't be a great solution for corporations. I think it's fair to say. But I defer to Sean on the actual best practices here from a legal perspective.
Well, and Sean, tell us, because I think I'm right in saying that corporations have a sentiment that they're not being taken care of, and I suspect that's wrong. I just don't know how they're being taken care of. I mean, you think about the Sony hack from North Korea as retaliation for making fun of this guy that's obviously got a very delicate ego. What else is going on? How are we protecting our citizenry?
Yeah, so every report that attempts to give us a snapshot of the extent to which we're seeing government and private industry cooperation always ends by calling for more of it, which suggests to me that we're not at an optimal level. I think Rob probably identified the reason why we're not at that optimal level, and there are basic disincentives on both parts to cooperate fully. The very sensitive nature and classified nature of cyber operations, the operational security concerns that are inherent to a cyber operation prevent the government from ever indicating exactly what it is doing. More importantly, perhaps what it's not doing. Just as reluctant the government might be to tell you what it's doing, it probably also doesn't want to tell you what it's not doing to expose a vulnerability to adversaries. And by the same token, for financial and reputational reasons, these firms have a strong incentive not to disclose their weaknesses as well. The level of cooperation, the level of cooperation in an operational sense has to be less than what we would desire. How that gets changed, I'm not sure. How we address that incentive structure so that there is greater incentive to cooperate, I'm not sure, particularly on an operational matter. I'm much more familiar with the extent to which legal cooperation is going on. That is, how well or how poorly does, say, Microsoft's vision of what international law says about cyber operations, how well or poorly does that jibe with the United States vision of what international law permits it to do or won't permit it to do? Do the things that the United States regards as unlawful by other states really marry up with what Microsoft would hope international law protects them from another state, for instance? There, I think the level of cooperation is only nascent. The meeting of the minds between these two communities, both of which have, I think, strong equities in what the law says, we're in only the very earliest stages of that cooperation. I'm excited at the potential for that kind of collaboration. I think it's important that private industry have a voice in the international legal positions taken by states, but boy, that cooperation is not particularly robust at the moment.
Okay, let's dig into that. This is great. So I'm assuming we have military liaisons, let's call them, at these large corporations, Verizon, Microsoft, these kinds of organizations. And so is that a good place to start? I mean, is this purely based on relationship? It's almost the same problem that the banks have when they have an issue calling the FBI in, right? They ultimately don't want the FBI sniffing around, but at the same time, they need their help when there is some kind of fraudulent activity. I think that's what we're dealing with here, right? In similar fashion. Yeah. So, but sure, the legal profession, you guys would sort of see that differently. You'd be able to have a conversation outside of the, not quite the politics of it, but outside of the protectionism that both sides have. What do you think of that?
Yeah, there may be clearinghouses or meeting points between the Department of Defense and industry. There certainly are in acquisition circles and in procurement and research and development circles. I'm not aware of the military having liaisons for the purposes of operational cooperation. That may or may not happen. That's outside my lane. But I can tell you that if there were such an architecture, there's no parallel legal architecture. There aren't formal legal liaisons. When the State Department goes over to negotiate a new treaty, there aren't standing arrangements in place whereby they cooperate with industry. There may be processes by which they can consult, but those aren't regularized processes or regular parts of the formation of our international legal positions. I don't know, Rob, are you aware of any?
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick, that's a great point. There are exercises that we do. I wouldn't say there's a lot of liaison at corporate level. There's exercises and efforts to meet the person across the table that you would work with in an emergency. And we've had scenarios that the Cyber Institute here at West Point even works with various municipalities. If this city, we've gone to a lot of cities in the US to do this, had a cyber attack contemporaneous with a hurricane, what would we do? Okay, everyone comes to the table, believe it. And I was like, yeah, well, we're used to the hurricane thing, but not a cyber attack during the hurricane if we live in Houston. Right. We did do this exercise. And it seems sort of fantastic, but it's beautiful. You have what we call a tabletop exercise. And so the government would be at the table there with smart folks like you, both of you, and then also corporations. You have the Verizon person there to say how this affects the telephone network. You have the biggest company in the city to see how it affects us. But I think the most important is actually knowing who your point of contact is at each of these agencies, because we're not set up necessarily to work on a daily basis together. Of course, you have Cyber Command, I think, would have a vote in this. So you have Futures Command in Austin, which is working on these sort of things. And everyone's very understanding of the protection of the private network. But it must be said, the challenge we have here is, you hear a lot about hackbacks and that sort of thing. We will not just defend in the way we were talking about earlier, but we've got to be able to do something. But what is that something? It can look like an attack from the United States. Not bad actors may not parse out the idea that this was a necessary. You can do things to stop attacks in a defensive posture as a corporation, but we wouldn't want to bind the U.S. with some sort of attack that violates international law. So that's the challenge we have, right? That's what we were talking about earlier. And I think that's when you say, we cannot do anything as a nation. You mentioned Sony, North Korea. We, Sony, cannot do anything, really, other than defend our corporate email accounts a little bit better and our movie production a little bit. Don't mess with us on our movie production. But we may need the government's help before vis-a-vis North Korea. We can't engage that's why that was a game changer. I think it's a great one you mentioned, because first time that you really saw a nation state attack via cyber methods a corporation.
Right.
Again, not to say it doesn't occur a lot more, but that was a big one that got us thinking about these things.
And you say it's a game changer. Did it change the game? And what actually happened? Was there something different that came out there? Because I'm actually surprised to hear. So if I've understood this correctly, large corporations such as the Microsofts that we brought up a little earlier don't have a dedicated liaison to the military, which that actually really surprises me. So, wow, really? See you nodding there. So that's not even one employee. Okay, well, I think that would certainly be a good place to start with fixing this. And then,
right. Well, that's right.
Yeah,
they're invited to events, and we have events together. So NATO has done a great job. Even if we take it out of the U.S., the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia, but you will have lots of corporations there with side by side with governments of all not just U.S., all nations. So, or a lot of nations. So I think they're working well together since that North Korea event, really well. There's certain events that cause us to change our game in a sense. Estonia was one of them when Russia shut down the network in Tallinn. That led to the promulgation of the Tallinn Manual, which Sean worked on. He's still a senior fellow there, I think, at the NATO Cyber Center.
Talk to us about that. Let's dig into the details on that one then. How am I spelling Tallinn again? It's T-A-L-U-M, isn't it?
T-A-L-L-I-N-N. Tallinn, as Sean would say, he spent a lot of time there.
And if I just do Tallinn, T-A-L-I-A-M.
Double L, double N.
Oh, double N. Yeah.
Yeah, 2 L's, 2 N's.
Okay.
I had to look it up when I was first invited there.
So give me another word to Google along with Tallinn. So
manual. Tallinn Manual.
Manual.
There it is. Okay, beautiful.
Yeah.
Right, talk to us about that, because is that the game changer after Sony hack? The Tallinn Manual, is that kind of?
No, not really. Yeah, not really. The Tallinn Manual is probably best described as a years-long process. About 2008 or so, NATO, through one of their centers of excellence, this one is located in Tallinn, Estonia, and is dedicated to cyber defense, invited a group of legal experts to write a manual that described how we thought the existing laws of war. So we were taking the law as it currently existed and trying to map it over a variety of cyber operations. Now, there you go. Yeah, so that's the first iteration of our work. And in that work, we focused exclusively on the laws of war. That is, we imagined scenarios where there was either a proper legal war or armed conflict existing. How would the cyber operations that were part of that war be regulated by the laws of war? What would constitute a lawful attack? What would not constitute a lawful attack? What does a violation of the rule that requires us to distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects? Well, how does that rule look in a cyber context? So that was the first project. That project was completed, I believe we finished roughly 2012 or so. But you know, we had this the sort of moment of realization about halfway through the first project, where we said, well, okay, these are relevant questions. These are interesting questions. They need to be addressed. But if you think about it, how many cyber incidents are really tied to a proper war? That is, if we survey all of the things that are happening in cyberspace at the moment and all the ways in which states are interacting through cyberspace, war might account for 0.005% of them. That is the vast majority of what states are doing in this you called it a contested space, is things that lie cleverly just below the threshold of war. That is, if I'm trying to undermine the economic or diplomatic success of a rival, I don't want to go to full war with them. I want to run just below the threshold of war. I want to make life difficult, frustrating, inefficient for them, but I don't want to cross any war thresholds here. And so as we realized that, we launched a second project. And this second project involved looking at international law much more broadly. So rather than focus on the laws of war, we focused on human rights law. We looked at notions of sovereignty. We looked at the United Nations contributions to preventing war in the first place. And this was, I think, a far more useful effort, frankly, a far more relevant effort to portray how international law might, if at all, regulate cyber operations.
Okay, fascinating.
Yeah, so there's a Tallinn Manual 2.0, and that reflects our broader effort to look at cyber context much more broadly.
Right, in the 2.0. Let's have a look at that one. We'll bring that up for the folks as well.
Yeah, it's got a teal colored cover or a greenish cover.
Yeah.
And for folks who are, there you go, look at that. Rob Barnsby's got his Tallinn Manual right in front of him.
Wouldn't leave home without it.
I think he carries one around, don't you?
I do.
I'm reading. Well done. That's right.
Excellent.
Okay. So this
excellent product.
This is so I suppose what we should be saying to industry, when I say that the sentiment is that they don't have air cover, what we need to say is, look, we're building the plane as we fly. I mean, this is technology in and of itself in the last 25 years. We're building the plane as we fly. So this is unknown, but we've got to lay the legal foundation in order for the government to know when they can protect you. Am I along the right lines? So thinking of Sony, we have free speech laws in America. It's quite very hard to keep hold of them. Don't have them in other countries. All of a sudden, keystrokes can now affect people in the other side of the world. And so this attack happens. If I'm Sony, I would be thinking, that's $100 million down the toilet. Wow. I want somebody to do something about this. And as you quite rightly point out, their GC is going to say you can't do anything about it because you presumably will understand this law. So once we've discovered, is this what we're doing with the Tallinn Manual? We're discovering what should be the legal and proportionate response to a nation state, or even, and this is another area we're going to start to move down here, but I want to hold on to this Tallinn Manual conversation for a few more moments. Even when there are cybercrime syndicates that are in Eastern Europe, I mean, we see so much from former USSR countries. Can we not hold the government of that country accountable, as we did with the Taliban in Afghanistan after 9/11? Surely there's something in a non-legal guy's mind like me saying, can we connect the dots there and then go after those former USSR countries and say, if your citizenry keeps attacking us, we're going to come after you and financially hit them? Is this where we're going?
It is, yeah. So painting a portrait of the international legal response structure was an important part of the work of the Tallinn Manual. Okay. And I have to condition this work by saying these are the views of private experts. So we were not representing nation states. We were not representing militaries. This was 20 or so international law specialists giving their best guess. But yeah, we were very much inspired by real cyber events, including, in fact, the Sony hack, which took place while we were doing our work. And so you'll find in the Tallinn Manual a fairly comprehensive portrait of the responses that are available. And we did our very best to imagine cyber scenarios, that is to have hypothetical scenarios tied to each of those responses. They range, in a nutshell, from a response at a very low level, that is a state that suffers an international wrong in a cyber context, can always protest, can do unfriendly things, can withdraw favorable treatment that it otherwise would have given that state. There are intermediary steps that involve taking proportionate responses, that is, violating a similarly grave or similarly less grave provision of international law. We international lawyers call these countermeasures. That is, I'm doing something unlawful in response to your predicate unlawful act. And then finally, we went all the way to the very extreme case of exercising self-defense. That is, we envisioned cyber scenarios that would give rise to a state's power or authority to use force, use destructive force, and initiate with what in common parlance might be called warlike acts in response to a cyber incident. So yeah, we tried to paint a very a comprehensive portrait of these measures. Now, the extent to which states agreed with our conclusions is still unfolding. We are seeing, in response to the Tallinn Manual, a number of states picking from our menu, if you like, saying, yeah, we agree with you on the unfriendly acts, we agree with you on the countermeasures, we're at a different place on self-defense, however. So, if I think there was a real upshot or a positive effect of the Tallinn Manual, I find it less the sort of interesting personal expressions of a bunch of lawyers. I find the more interesting aspect of the Tallinn Manual process, states' responses to it. To the extent we've been able to enliven states or energize states to tell us what they think about the law in this area, then I think the Tallinn Manual project has been quite successful.
Right, right.
And just to continue, I'm monologuing here a bit, but
Please,
Eddie, I found your resort to the Sony example quite interesting, because there, I think most people were frankly a little disappointed and certainly underwhelmed by the US legal characterizations of that incident. I think there were a number of us who were hoping there would be a stronger expression of international law indignity on the part of the United States. The sovereignty had been violated, the data had been destroyed, that this was intrusive and this was going after a private actor. How dare you go after one of our corporations? Now, we went to the extent of actually attributing, right? So there were public statements by the US government saying, we know you did it, North Korea. Right. But frankly, the legal characterizations, the demonization in legal terms of North Korea that accompanied that attribution was pretty underwhelming. And if I were Sony, I might think, my gosh, really? I mean, you're not going to call this a violation of sovereignty. You're not going to call this an unlawful attack. You're not going to say we were attacked. Right. So the incident may have revealed a gap in thinking between the expectations of corporations, the extent to which international law might have protected them, and the US government's, frankly, very, very careful, very measured, conservative legal characterizations of that incident.
Yeah, politics and diplomacy. Rob, yeah, please.
Quickly, to add on to that, though, about 10 years later, great points all, but it did earn North Korea a place in our strategy documents and in this Solarium document I'm talking about, which is named as a bad actor. So the attribution that Sean's talking about means something at some point. We could debate the usefulness of that, but North Korea, China, Iran, and Russia have key spots named in our strategies throughout the last few years and in that commission, which is kind of rare for us to do as a government, I think it's fair to say, to name these four, and North Korea is there. And so what flows from that is obviously budgetary dollars and money and congressional perspectives, like, wow, these are really four. And if you ask the cadets or our law students at our law schools we've taught at, they are aware of these kind of things, and they will quickly rattle off North Korea as a bad actor in this arena. So my point is that it has earned them a place somewhere that they don't want to be necessarily, or perhaps they do want to be as a measure of, national strength. But those four are the ones you hear even our students say right away. They know intuitively: North Korea, China, Iran, Russia. Right. So again, without getting into all of that, I have to say that the Sony attack earned North Korea a special place at that table.
Good. And as long as something concrete comes out of that, I mean, look, I'm noticing the time, so we should wrap shortly. But what I'd love to do is, Sean, you mentioned Microsoft a little later. They're a really great kind of strategic partner for us. And I know a few people over there. I think in maybe halfway through 2021, if I can have you gentlemen back with a Microsoft person to say, hey, look, how can we create some kind of liaison between industry and government and the legality of cyber? I think that would make a tremendously interesting dialogue. Perhaps one of the cyber folks and then somebody from some kind of government department. that would be interesting. So if you're willing to come back and do that next year, that would be lovely. I think we've shown some really great assets. Let me just recap them for the audience. If folks want to get a hold of you, you can get a hold of either of you through the United States Military Academy of West Point, just looking up your names there. And of course on LinkedIn as well with Sean. We looked at the Articles of War from the Library Institute. I'm going to be favoriting that one. So that's really great. Happy to contribute too. So let me know. And if there are folks listening to this that want to contribute, you can get a hold of both of the professors, as I pointed out there. We've got the Solarium Commission. I want to dig into that one too before our next conversation. And then of course the Talon Manual 2.0 right there. Okay, wonderful. I think we probably just have to end right there. I've got so much more to say to you, but are there any parting words, anything you want to promote from your work, anything at all? Just go for it in our last few minutes together.
Well, I think
Rob actually put together a product that we both agree is very useful. Rob, you want to introduce that?
I do. I was going to say full circle here, the NATO CCD COE. Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. They might change their name sometime a little shorter, but that's what it's known by. Has, pursuant to the Talon Manual project Sean is talking about, put out an interactive toolkit for practitioners. So I think your listeners would enjoy this, and it can be found. I can send you the link, or if you find it, that's great. But I think you could look up CCD Cyber Law Toolkit. Now that is very good for cyber lawyers we have basically put on there a bunch of scenarios that could happen and how to respond, what is the law regarding each scenario. But it's not just for lawyers. I think national level, corporate level practitioners have found that this is a very good tool, and it's updated often, and you can sort of take a look at the examples and flow through them, which could affect corporations on a daily basis. And it does have a little bit on elections, it does have on hacking and that sort of thing. So it's a repository for what we think some of our smartest colleagues think are the best ways to handle these things, admittedly from a governmental perspective, but I wouldn't look past that as a very good toolkit, a resource for all of our listeners. And that's our gift.
Thank you.
We'd like to share.
It's wonderful. Yeah. So I'll make sure that the links of these are both in. It'll go up on our YouTube channel as well as we'll stream this through LinkedIn. It's probably how a bunch of people are looking at today. So you'll see links with all of that stuff there. Professors Watts and Barnaby, thank you so much. This was an absolutely fantastic dialogue for me. So greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Eddie.
All right.